Gentlemen, how are you doing? Welcome.
Very well, thank you. Morning.
Good morning. Very well, thanks. And thank you for having us, Philip.
Yes, nice to see you. And thank you very much to Dataminr for supporting this event and so many other events. It's a pleasure to have you on board.
Not at all. They're always tremendous events, so delighted to be with you once again.
Fantastic. Well, please keep those questions coming in the Q&A function and the chat. I'm going to hand over to a fireside chat on converged security, looking at the two sides of business resilience. Tim and John, you have the floor.
Thanks,
Philip. Again, good morning, John. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too, Tim.
First
of all, apologies for all the junk behind me. I couldn't work out how to turn on the whizzy background. So
not at all.
I think you're with computers.
It adds credibility to. So no, not at all. So I think just a quick point, perhaps to all the attendees as well. Although this is going to be a fireside chat between John and I, please, if you've got any questions at all that you'd like to put to John or indeed to me, but I suggest you'll probably get a better answer from John, feel free to send those in via the chat function. So quick introduction. John, you've been involved in the security world, both physical and cyber, for decades now, across all sorts of industries. You've been involved in finance, CISO at some of the world's biggest financial institutions, some of the world's biggest energy companies, luxury goods, pharma. You know, in many ways, the sort of CV that I would look at and think that's what I want to be when I grow up. So a huge amount of experience. But looking at the cyber domain first. In your previous roles across all of these industries, you know, not all cyber threats or indeed physical threats are created equal. How did you go about sort of ranking these and categorizing, prioritizing what you needed to look at and address?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and the logic and rigor with which, as a CISO, you have to approach that problem of ranking them has become more and more, it needs to become more and more rigorous as the conversations about cyber have risen up the company, and you know, now is a constant common conversation in the boardroom. And to put it very simply, there's no point in talking about cyber security or cyber insecurity as a threat by itself, because, I mean, we just have technology spread across all of our businesses, and there are many, many ways in which that technology or the uses of it by people, and it's people who make businesses work, those uses, there are many ways in which they can fail, and hence whatever is of value in the company can be insecure. So the first step, I think, is to understand that you've got to decompose cyber security into component parts. So the approach that I found most effective to doing that is to actually do scenario building. It's to look at the business you're in, the way it uses IT, the value that IT brings to the business, and so the way that value is manipulated using IT, and look at scenarios in which that value could be put at risk, the way IT could go wrong if someone with malicious intent was to determine it. And in doing so, to build up, if you like, a catalog of failure modes, and then to look at, well, what is it about the way the company runs its IT systems which could reduce the risk of each of those failure modes, and to go through a cyclical process of analysis to determine those which are least protected against, those scenarios that are least protected against. And then the final step is to overlay the value that those aspects of the business that are at risk bring to the business. So what you end up with is those two things that you obviously plot on various ways, but typical corporate heat map, you know, all of those lovely red, amber, green colors that you get on a heat map, you end up with the likelihood and the impact. And you can then bring that to the table for discussion. Now, that's, of course, all very easy to say. But as the CISO, as the security professional more generally, there are some key dependencies you have in going through that process. So first of all, no CISO I know of can speak authoritatively about the value in the business. And in fact, very many CISOs can speculate about how the business actually uses IT systems, but it's really the people at the front line of the business who know how the business processes engage with those systems. So this is not a technical analysis first and foremost. This is really about understanding the way your business works, the way the value in the business is distributed across those systems. And so it behoves the CISO to be out there engaging in that process with the front line of the business. It's the business that is the authority on the value, and it's the business that knows how they actually use the systems. Not an IT guy, not a CISO. But what you bring to the table as a CISO is inherent knowledge about how things can fail in security terms, and that knowledge about that method, that structure. So that's the way that I think has been most effective in my experience in ranking cybersecurity.
I think that's a really key point, that the value of the business is best understood by the business leaders. And I think it goes to an extent to the comment made, I think, by Nathan on the previous panel of often the CISO or the CSO is thrown under the bus when something happens. Because it's that level of engagement, because ultimately the business owns the risk. And they need to address it, invest in it, and take that decision fundamentally as to what is going to be acceptable versus unacceptable risk based on objectively understanding where the points of failure are and the likely impact.
And if I can add to that, Tim,
yeah,
that, you know, and I've been there. I've been working in business, and we've had major incidents, and so unfortunately, I've never actually lost my job as a direct result of a single incident. But where the CISO is at risk, it's typically because the general understanding of the business is wrong in as much as security is black-white. You're insecure or you're secure. And one of the best ways of getting around that is going through that process of enumerating these scenarios and presenting them as complex chains of control, which therefore are complex scenarios in which certain controls can fail. And so you're beginning to build an understanding on the business side that security isn't this easy thing. It is this complicated thing. And it is something where, you know, to sort of petulantly say, hey, you're the CISO, it was your fault that we got hacked, actually is illogical as a reaction.
Yeah, completely agree with that, because it's fundamentally managing a degree of uncertainty. You know, there are all sorts of variables out there. We're looking at threat actors. There are people behind that. There are sort of various attack vectors that we need to look at. And I think that perhaps that tendency to instinctively, to an extent, it's human nature, right? Something happens, we must blame somebody. But is that perhaps, again, going back to the previous panel, there's an observation that business risk is often kept separate from security risk. Now, they are part of the same puzzle, but if you've got that perceived distinction within the organization, do you think that perhaps exposes the security team more to that knee-jerk response by the business leaders when something bad happens?
Yeah, I think absolutely does. I can think of examples where, many examples where, in fact, you know, yes, if you're managing enterprise risk for the company as a whole, you've got to call out a number of categories of risk that you're going to use to frame the conversation. So one category might be data protection, your exposure under privacy legislation. Another might be cybersecurity. And yes, they are different. So privacy, actually, on occasion, the mandates under law to protect the privacy of data can actually work against the requirement to secure the cyber aspects of an organization. So, for example, privacy would limit the extent of monitoring of user behavior, whereas monitoring of user behavior is one of the key tools potentially to help secure the organization. So they can be at conflict, but they can actually also be the same thing. So if I look at the company I'm working with at the moment, and I look at the main drivers behind the rating of risk in data protection, they are essentially modes of loss which can only be protected against with cybersecurity mechanisms, technology and processes, and education of people. So again, as you say, it's a mistake for the top of the business to simply see cyber in isolation, to see it as something that is all the CISO's fault, or as is actually still commonly the case, they see it as the CIO's fault. They see it as the IT group, and to some extent, cybersecurity gets tarred with the brush of the fuzziness of return on investment that many businesses feel about what they spend on IT. Yeah. It still makes matters worse. But I think, again, if you can bring that conversation to the boardroom in a structured way, and then if you can manage to get sufficient time, and it doesn't take a huge amount of time, you can draw those connections between the different risks, and then the business stands a likelihood of seeing cyber risk in the context of the bigger slew of business risks.
Yeah, and actually some good comments coming in as well on the chat, and a couple of questions as well, so the question from Charlotte, we'll actually get to that in a moment. But I think, Gal, you also make a very valid point there. We've spoken about the fact that the business owns the risk. They don't necessarily always understand that. And there is definitely a big role for the security teams to play, to actually educate them. And we also need, in the security world, to be proactive and on the front foot, to go to them and help educate them. I think many of the things that we perhaps take for granted because we've been in this our whole careers, other parts of the business don't necessarily understand because it's not what they've been doing. But I was also just wondering, in your experience, John, across different industry sectors, have you seen that there has been a marked difference to approaching this across industry sectors, or perhaps have you seen certain sectors are more mature, better at getting to grips with this?
Well, it's an old sort of standby of at least the cybersecurity profession that the banks focus on cybersecurity more than anyone else and spend more money on it and so on. Now, that may still be the case. They spend more money on it, although my belief is that the reason they do that is because they're so heavily regulated, and that doesn't necessarily make them more secure in proportion to the amount of more money they spend on it. So what I'm getting at is actually, if you'd asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have said, banking, finance, well, actually banking, not finance generally, because insurance is in a different place, right out there in front, possibly followed by pharma, possibly followed by oil and gas, and so on. What I see today is a landscape which is much different, much more nuanced, much more mixed. Certain trends in the latest threats like ransomware, which principally damage the availability, have flipped over the agenda in many businesses. So if you're a manufacturing business, if you can't manufacture, look at Honda from the last few days, for example. You're in danger of your revenue going from X to zero overnight. And so I think in terms of importance of cybersecurity, we're in a world where there are very few businesses of scale at least, where cyber isn't right up there. It's either number one risk in the enterprise risk model, or 2 or 3, or it's certainly in the top 5. And levels of spend, certainly as a proportion of IT, again, are leveling out. If you look at the data that some of the analysts produce, they're beginning to level out. Regulation skews things, as I said, for banks, it's beginning to skew things in a few other areas. But I'd say it's a common theme today.
Okay, and then thinking about the converged approach, and I think some of the elements that come out of the Honda scenario, perhaps we can start to apply to this. What are the opportunities around converged, a blended approach, bringing cyber and physical together? Why is this something that companies should be doing?
Well, I think, we talked a lot about risk and having that risk conversation in the boardroom. If there's one thing that, having been a sort of a CISO with responsibility for physical security and cyber security in my past, one thing that struck me very strongly is the extra degree of comfort that senior managers in the business have with physical security, and an extra degree of ownership they have. Mm. And that's partly because it's physical. People understand why, a fire can damage the business, or someone breaking in and stealing stuff can damage the business. It's very accessible. But it's also, I think, because of the way physical security professionals tend to focus on that people-to-people engagement. And I think there's an awful lot to cyber security as a profession can learn from that. So that's point one. I think point two, again, we've talked a lot about risk and the risk method, the method of assessing risk. And I think there's commonality across failure modes, if you like, of any type, whether it's physical or cyber. And I think actually in some ways, there's quite a lot of physical security you can learn from the rigor with which cybersecurity risk has to be pursued. So that's something going the other way as a common purpose. Then, of course, there is the tendency towards blended threats. Now, I personally experienced numbers of incidents where there's been a physical security component and a cybersecurity component, which has either been a mixture of those components in the build-up to a threat being realized. So maybe it's physical security surveillance by an attacker, or it's physical theft of information, which then enables a cyber threat, or it's actually in the conduct of it. So we all know now that you don't have any physical security technology deployed, which isn't to some degree representing a high-level computing device, which is probably networked and in many cases is directly connected to the internet. So clearly, what physical security is dependent on in terms of devices, particularly for detection and alerting, is a cyber security asset that needs cyber security protection. So again, that working together is important. And there are other areas of synergy. I think one thing that struck me from the previous conversation, which I'd just like to put on the table, is I think we as security professionals have failed to tap into those benefits of convergence. And one of the main reasons I think that's happened is that we've seen that convergence as organizational convergence. So I myself, as I said, I've managed a combined organization, physical and cyber, in the past. I've actually seen the stresses and strains that produces, because you have people who come from different backgrounds with different skills, and you munge them together into one organization. It doesn't necessarily work. And I've also seen just people getting at the top of the organization getting overloaded by the spread of work involved that you've got to encompass in a joined up organization. It is my belief, and again, I've seen this work, that you don't have to converge organizationally. You can converge on all of those things that I was mentioning a minute ago as collaboration across the organization. That's the most effective route forwards.
Well, and I think that's an interesting point, because I'm going to actually ask perhaps a slightly contrary question now as a sort of follow-up.
Okay.
We've spoken a lot about convergence, and it's, in theory, well, I think pretty much everyone on this forum agrees that it is a good thing. But you've touched on the fact that, practically speaking, it can be challenging to implement. So while in theory it makes sense, this has been on agendas for years now, and it's not really happening. It's happened to degrees, but we're still talking about it. So actually, practically speaking, is it a good idea? Is this something that organizations should actually be doing?
The simple answer is, I'm afraid I'm a true believer. I say yes, absolutely. But I think the way to do it is probably at the top and the bottom of the organization. What do I mean by that? If you can, by working with, if you're a leader on the physical side or cyber side, you can work with your cyber or physical colleagues to have a joined up conversation at the board level, then lots and lots of benefits will happen, because you're relating perhaps a conversation about something that's difficult for the board members to understand, i.e. cyber, to something that's easier for them to understand. So there's benefit, and actually there's benefit the other way around as well, but let's not dwell too long on that. But there's benefit there. The other end of the organization is to my mind, really where the maximal benefit comes from, and yet we tend not to start there. So, I encourage the teams that I manage, whether they're physical or cyber, to just simply pick up the phone and work together. Not a big organized construct, not necessarily, a shared intelligence forum, whatever they call them, fusion center for intel, not necessarily a joined up SOC and GSOC, at least at first, but instead, so you're a cyber guy, you're trying to tackle the operational technology problem in a large oil and gas company. You're sitting in some corporate center function, the theory about how to cyber protect the operational technology, but you haven't the faintest idea how a refinery works, what the situation on the ground is, what a field engineer does. But your physical security colleagues are very likely to be experts in that. Yeah. And so just pick up the phone, talk to each other.
I think that's the key thing. Often there is perhaps a tendency to try and think it's an all or nothing approach. It's the fusion center or nothing. And collaboration is the starting point of that. I'm a big believer in asking the question constantly of what are we trying to achieve? And if we're focusing on that, we can then figure out a way to do it. And, I think the example of the oil refineries is completely valid. We've seen that to an extent as well, just at I suppose in some ways, a fairly simplistic level with the protests in the US as well, where there is a tendency, understandably, to look at that as purely a physical issue because it's very visible. But we also know that there have been instances of hacker groups getting involved as well and hacking, for example, some of the US police departments. I think the Minneapolis Police Department was actually hacked in their database, fortunately an old one, but details of some of the police officers then being released. So we need to be aware of that. And so bringing that as well, and you've touched on this in one of your earlier answers or earlier comments about how digital technology can be used to mitigate physical threats. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think, having said in the previous answer, don't start by trying to have a joined up GSOC, cyber SOC arrangement. One thing I see as a persistent common problem is this inadequate protection in the installation and operation of physical security, surveillance, alarming, alerting devices. Now, obviously there are various different ways that the businesses actually have those devices managed. Many of them, of course, the management is effectively outsourced to a guarding or alerting function. There is a tremendous opportunity by bringing the signaling, so I'm in danger of getting too technical here, but bringing the signaling from all of those physical devices and mixing it in with the same streams of information that you're getting from all the various cyber, intrusion detection systems, proxy logs from the network boundary, but bringing them into the same sort of body of technical expertise, which typically you have in a SOC. I think there's a huge opportunity to make a big step forwards in securing those physical security essential tools. Now, I don't know how that, I mean, I've done this a couple of times. It can be quite complicated organizationally, believe it or not, not from the point of view of the internal organization, but in terms of the external providers, particularly on the physical security side. But it is possible. And why do I say that there are huge benefits? Well, it is actually non-trivial to cyber secure a lot of these physical security devices that are deployed out there. It's non-trivial because actually quite a lot of the estate is old, are old devices. They may be still networked together, but they're not prepared to be cyber secured, if you like, in the same way as you can secure a laptop. And so one of the approaches you can use to keeping them secure despite that deficiency is to have monitoring that's sensitive to the changes in behavior of that device that would indicate it's been compromised. And that's not just switching it on and off, by the way. So, you know, so I think it's a bit deep techy, but there's a great opportunity to begin to protect the physical world, the physical tool set against the cyber threat through that technical integration at the front line.
Yeah, interesting. And just sort of conscious as well of time, because I think there's a huge amount that we could dive into here. Although actually, I just want to bring up a point actually that Ellie H has raised, which I think is actually a valid one. It goes again to some of what we were discussing previously about engaging with the business. And it's an idea I've seen used well before. We've spoken about the challenge of bringing this to the table at senior board level membership. But Ellie's suggestion is to leverage communications teams to help with the messaging. And I think, again, this goes back to where I've seen security programs rolled out well and where I've seen them rolled out less effectively. Those security leaders who are able to engage with parts of the business well are those who will have success. And there's perhaps a tendency, and I confess that I come more from the physical side, so to look at some of the communication softer skills, perhaps with a degree of distrust. You know, we are security people, we don't need to engage in that. And so I'm just sort of wondering as well, teasing that out a bit further, to the convergence piece, is there perhaps, because people often come from different backgrounds, is there perhaps a bit of a cultural issue there to that integration? Because people are quite territorial about, you know, we're the security guys, simplistically executive protection has a particular reputation, or there's an image of it when you talk about a bodyguard versus the image you get when you talk about a cyber security expert.
Yes.
Do you think that's a challenge?
Absolutely, it's a challenge. And actually, that's one of the aspects that gets in the way of effective convergence if you take an organizational convergence approach. I have seen, you know, a large oil and gas company I worked in, which had taken a deliberate first steps towards integration. And I've seen people from one side who get immersed in the other side, if you like, physical versus cyber, sink because of that sort of, the backgrounds are so different, the styles are so different, the soft skills are so different. And there's a degree of suspicion, as you say, you know, the techies, you know, I call myself a techie. We are terrible at looking down on anyone who isn't techie. Equally, you know, there is suspicion the other way around. Actually, most physical security people in my experience tend to look down on the techies as being too fast and loose. But so there are, though, things that each side can learn from the other. So one of the most effective things I've tried is where we have to get the cybersecurity message out to frontline staff. I've used physical security to deliver it. Because if we call security as a profession rather than physical and cyber, physical security more often than not is the acceptable, from the front line of the business point of view, it's the acceptable face of security. They're the people they know and love, or, you know, at least respect. Whereas us cyber techies, you know, are tend to be difficult to consume. So should we say? So absolutely, it's a very important issue.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, also sometimes that's just a function of where people are. You know, physical security, often you are there on the front line, where cyber, perhaps you don't need to be. Although I do confess, you know, coming from the physical world, there have been times, there's one that immediately comes to mind when I was in the swamps of Sudan doing a risk assessment, and I was looking quite enviously at the cyber chaps back at HQ, and you know, sort of certainly what looked like a lot of luxury. Yeah, no. Well, John, I think we're up against time now. So thank you very much for your thoughts. I think it's been tremendously insightful. Thank you to everyone on the panel as well, or sorry, those attending, and for your questions and comments. Try to address as many as we could. But I think, you know, such an interesting topic. We could do this all day and still not cover it, but we'll have to draw a line under it right there. So, John, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Tim.